The night a dial-up found a space navy, Gary McKinnon couldn't sleep. Nights stretched long in a small flat outside London, the late 199s drifting into the early 200s, and the only thing that cut the quiet was the screech of a dial-up modem. He was curious, almost to a fault, pulled into stories about suppressed energy, UFO sightings, and the strange claim that somewhere in the system, the truth sat on an unguarded drive. Back then, after the shock of September 11th, a lot of networks weren't locked down the way they should have been. He found remote desktops wide open with VNC or PC Anywhere, no passwords at all. Windows shares that should have been locked behind a dozen approvals were just there. He wasn't smashing through firewalls. He was knocking on doors and finding them unlatched. The question driving him was simple. Did NASA have evidence of something off-planet that never made it to the public? He wasn't trying to wreck anything. He wanted the pictures people said were scrubbed, the logs that might prove it wasn't all talk. That's how he ended up on a NASA-connected machine late one night, watching a desktop wallpaper of Earth and a neat row of icons labeled with image tools, preprocessors, and batch scripts. He clicked a folder and hit a directory full of raw image files, huge, hundreds of megabytes each. Over a dial-up line, that's like trying to drink through a pinhole. Still, he queued one. As the image crawled in line by line, something took shape. A craft, not a speck, not a blur, long and smooth, cigar-shaped, without seams or rivets. He watched pixels sharpen into edges. Then the connection died, or was killed. He never forgot the shape. For years, people told stories about Building 8 at Johnson Space Center. Donna Hare, she'd worked for Philco Ford as a NASA contractor, said there was a routine for airbrushing oddities out of photos before release. Gary had heard that. He didn't trust hearsay. But these folders didn't feel like rumor. He saw the before files. He saw smaller after versions in the public directories. And he saw the toolchain names that made those afters happen. He kept looking. Images were one thing. They could always say calibration, compression, normal pre-processing. Words are harder to wish away. So he dug for text. Somewhere in the sprawl, he found an Excel file. He opened it, and his world tilted. The sheet had a label so blunt it felt like a dare, Non-Terrestrial Officers. Below it, rows and columns, clean as any logistics tracker. Ranks he didn't recognize sitting next to billets that didn't map to known branches. No USAF, no USN tags, just titles and vessels with names that didn't belong to any fleet you could Google. USSS Hillenkoetter. USSS LeMay. About 8 to 10 ship names, he said, and nothing looked like a hull number. He scrolled to a second sheet. Fleet-to-fleet transfers. Dates, positions, what looked like duty cycles and movement. The language sounded like routine. Not test article. Not prototype. Transfers. He stared because it meant something bigger than a lab. Moving people between ships means multiple ships. Multiple ships means a fleet. Words non-terrestrial implied a place of service that wasn't Earth. He didn't grab the file. That still haunts the story. He did what he could over a threadbare connection. He wrote down names, screen-captured file names, and tried to back out without tripping anything. And then his screen locked. Somewhere, someone noticed the open door and decided to slam it. From that moment, the stakes weren't theoretical. The United States wanted him extradited. Prosecutors painted him as a dangerous intruder. Maximum penalties, decades. He wasn't accused of destroying data. He was accused of browsing where he shouldn't and leaving taunting notes, the kind of thing a bored hacker might do. But the response went way beyond an annoyed admin. It was an international squeeze. At home, he unraveled. An autism diagnosis, depression, family pulled through court dates and headlines. That's how the system wins most fights. Fear does the work even when the facts don't show sabotage. Meanwhile, the paper trail grew real. Home Office statements. Affidavits. DOJ filings that kept the heat on. You don't throw that kind of weight at nothing. Skeptics say non-terrestrial could mean non-ground-based, like satellites, or just a sloppy internal term. They say USSS might be a joke prefix. They say giant images are normal when you're stitching orbital shots. And yeah, sometimes a pre-processing pipeline is just a pipeline. But you know what doesn't fit? Ranks and billets without a service branch, vessel names that never appear on registries, and a transfer sheet that reads like a Navy schedule. What he saw wasn't a grand speech or a gotcha clip. It looked like inventory. Logistics. The dull backbone of every real operation. The kind of spreadsheet a chief yeoman updates without thinking, because people have to move, billets have to turn, and ships have to keep schedules. Gary didn't have a perfect capture, and that's the weakness critics love to lean on. But the context around him, the images, the tool chains, the Building 8 rumors that predated him, made the words land harder. He kept asking himself the same question you're hearing now. If this was nothing, why did they act like he'd found a fault line? He told friends the sheet listed 8 to 10 vessels. He remembered the two names because they were hard to forget. USSS Hillenkoetter, like the first CIA director. USSS LeMay, like the Air Force general who built Strategic Air Command. That's a naming pattern with a message, guardians of the unseen. And if you're running something off-world, you'd need that kind of edge, command, secrecy, logistics. From that night on, he couldn't unknow it. He'd sat alone, lit by a monitor, hearing the modem hiss, watching a seamless, silver shape almost finish loading. He'd seen column headers that should have had no place on a NASA-connected system, and he'd felt the door slam shut the moment he realized what he'd walked into. So the question that started as curiosity hardened into a bet. The public story of space is one timeline. The classified story is another. Gary stumbled into the second one, and the machine moved to make sure nobody else followed him through that same open door. The Excel that shouldn't exist. So picture the cursor hovering, that tiny pause before a click changes your life. He double-clicked the file with a bland name that sounded like admin chores. And then it opened, and he saw a label you wouldn't expect on any civilian machine. Non-Terrestrial Officers. Not a memo, not an acronym wall. A proper worksheet, calm and boring in the way real logistics always look. Here's the thing about spreadsheets. They have a feel. If you've ever kept rosters or duty schedules, you know the rhythm. Columns you can scan at a glance, data types that make sense together. This one read like a personnel ledger. Rank, billet, surname given name, duty station, vessel, start date, rotation. He couldn't remember the exact headers later, but the pattern stuck because it felt like muscle memory from every org that has to move people with precision. The ranks didn't map. No USAF, no USN, no Army fields. They looked like ranks, but they weren't wearing a branch. That's what hit him first. Then the vessel column pulled focus. He read names that didn't belong to any registry he could find later. USSS Hillenkoetter, USSS LeMay. He froze because those aren't random. Roscoe Hillenkoetter, a Navy admiral who became the first CIA director in the late 1940s, sat at the birth of America's modern intelligence apparatus. Quiet committees, compartmented reporting, and the first post-war attempts to corral unidentified sightings. Curtis LeMay, the Air Force general who built Strategic Air Command in the 1950s and 1960s, embodied hard deterrence, alert crews, constant readiness, command and control that never sleeps. If you were building a quiet perimeter force, those names send a message to insiders without saying a word. No hull numbers sat next to them, at least none he remembered. Nothing like CVN 68 or DDG formatting. Just names, and not one or two. He said 8 to 10 vessels appeared across rows, like a fleet list flattened into personnel assignments. That number nagged him because it meant scale. One craft is a project. 10 named vessels is an organization. He scanned right and saw what looked like movements. Rotation windows. Maybe a TAD-style code. Kind of fields a yeoman. Updates when someone finishes a tour and ships out to another command. He clicked the second tab. Fleet-to-fleet transfers. Now we're in the language of a Navy, not a lab. Transfers aren't test notes. Transfers are how you keep humans and parts moving between platforms that actually operate together. He tried to copy the file. Over dial-up, even a small Excel sheet can choke, and he wasn't on a stable line. He grabbed what he could, file names he could capture, the vessel names he could jot, the column feel he could memorize. In his head, it felt less like a roster and more like a map to a door they thought was locked forever. He knew that wasn't enough, but he also knew hanging around was a mistake. He started to back out, and the session seized up. It felt like someone watching the same screen from the other side and yanking the cord. Skeptics later said non-terrestrial could just mean off-site or off-Earth data nodes, not humans. Okay, fair. But then why the officer model? Why billets? Why names tied to vessels, not workstations or projects? And why fleet to fleet instead of server to server or lab to lab? Words matter in big systems. They get formalized. They travel through policy. They settle into templates. You don't stumble into naval phrasing by accident across multiple tabs. He looked up Department of Defense naming patterns as a sanity check. The Navy assigns hull classifications. NASA doesn't keep an officer corps. The Air Force and Space Command have billets, but they don't run ships named USSS anything. USSS as a prefix doesn't sit in public doctrine. It reads like a black designation, United States Space Ship, used only inside a compartment where the people using it already agreed what it means. What's more, he said the entries read routine. Not exercise, not trial, not engineering change proposal. Transfers, report dates, rotations, that screams standing force. If someone wanted to poison the well with a fake, they'd make it flashy, exotic ranks, wild code names. Instead, it was dry. Boring is the tell here. Boring is how truth hides in a bureaucracy. He also noticed a tiny thing that stuck with him. No unit patches, no branch identifiers in any cell. That silence is a design choice. In special access programs, you separate identifiers so a lost page doesn't burn the whole program. You keep context off the document. A roster that leans on vessel names alone makes sense if the vessel is the unit. He didn't get the checksum. He didn't snapshot the full sheet. That's the opening critics walk through. But you have to weigh that against the rest of the room he was standing in, a NASA-connected machine, an image toolchain aligned with pre-public workflows, building 8 rumors from Donna Hare's era at Philco Ford pointing at exactly this kind of pre-processing, and then this spreadsheet with naval bones. He tried to cross-check those vessel names afterward. Nothing in open registries. Nothing in Jane's. He did find that Hillenkoetter had a history in early UFO oversight claims, which only made the name choice feel like an inside wink. LeMay's reputation for hard deterrence fit a perimeter mission more than exploration. That's pattern, not proof, but pattern is how you decide where to dig next. And that second tab, fleet to fleet, kept pulling him back. Transfers between what fleets, if officially there's only one public space program and it doesn't run ships? To have fleet to fleet as a casual category, you either have 2 squadrons operating as distinct groups, or you've got cover terms standing in for classified task forces. Either way, we're past test beds. We're talking operations heavy enough to need continuous churn. He walked away from that night carrying 3 things he couldn't shake: vessel names with a message, officer structures without a branch, and transfer language that made it all feel normal. Routine is the scariest word in this story. If it's routine, it's real. And if it's real, you're staring at a command hierarchy that lives off our maps. The image that would not fit on Earth. So let's sit in that room with him for a second. The modem hiss, the screen glow, the cursor inching across a progress bar that feels glued in place. Over dial-up, a 200 megabyte file is punishment. Yet that's what he queued because the directory said RAW, and the sizes were absurd for public-facing images in the early 200s. They weren't thumbnails. They were the kind of files you'd expect from a sensor built to see everything. The first thing he noticed wasn't the picture. It was the pattern. The folders looked like steps in a factory. RAW, CAL, Level 1. Level 2, Public. If you've ever worked any kind of pipeline, you know the rhythm of names people settle on when they move data from messy to clean. Only here, the clean versions were much smaller. That gap isn't proof of a cover-up, but it's where you start looking if you think something's being trimmed. He'd heard the lore about building 8 at Johnson Space Center. For years, people said images went there before they went out. Donna Hare, a contractor from the 197's era at Philco Ford, claimed the airbrushing wasn't drama. It was scheduling. Process the oddities, then release the set. Gary treated it as a rumor until he saw a machine laid out like a production line. That alignment, the rumor and the folders, tightened his focus. The file crawled in line by line like an old fax building a secret. He expected noise, stars, thermal hiss, maybe a satellite edge. Instead, a shape started to form. Long, smooth. No seams, no rivets, no external clutter. A silver, cigar-shaped craft against black. Not atmosphere. Not clouds. Just black. He leaned in because the human eye can't help it when a curve turns into a hull. The image sharpened, and then the session froze. That's the last clean thing he saw on that file. Skeptics jump in here. They say big images are normal. Raw feeds need calibration. Level and Level 1 products are huge because they carry sensor junk you strip before release. True, that's real. But here's the thing, scale matters and so does destination. These weren't just raw dumps into a science archive. They sat in a structure that led to public-friendly folders. And the tool names in the desktop tray weren't lab toys. They were batch processors with presets. That smells like a workflow tuned to output, not exploration. He tried another image. Same deal, massive size, incremental load, then a stall like someone else touched the mouse. Know that eerie feeling when your cursor fights back? He swore he felt it. That's not evidence by itself, but pair it with what came later. The knock on his door, the extradition push. And that moment starts to feel less like bad luck and more like detection. The airbrushing argument always sounds cheesy until you think about pressure. Public images live forever. One odd pixel will end up on front pages if someone wants it to. If your job is to make sure nothing derails missions, you scrub the anomalies under calibration. That word buys you room. Compression buys more. Both are true and cover a lot. Calibration and compression are blankets big enough to hide under. File size tells a different story too. These were multi-hundred megabyte frames in an era when most users still saw the web in tiny bytes. That implies high-resolution sensors, either in orbit or beyond it. If you're moving that kind of data, you need an architecture to process it. The directories showed exactly that. Raw in, tools run, smaller out. The question isn't whether pre-processing happens. It's what, specifically, is getting lost between those stages, and why the public gets the smallest slice. Meanwhile, he started noticing checks that didn't quite tally. Dates that suggested a set came in one batch, but metadata hinting the raw had been touched before the public ever existed. You can bury an edit under a level change if nobody audits the checksum chain. Who audits that chain? Almost nobody outside the room. He wasn't the first to say this, and that matters. Donna Hare's timeline predates him by decades. Other researchers pointed out clouds that didn't line up edge to edge, stars that blinked out across releases, little pixel quirks you only find if you overlay two versions. On their own, those can be compression artifacts. Together, across sites and years, they look like a habit. So when he saw that silver, seamless hull half-load and then vanish behind a frozen cursor, he didn't file it under mystery. He filed it under process. Something big enters. Something smaller leaves. The middle is where the edits live. If you're running ships with no public names, that middle is where you'd make sure nobody sees them. And here's where the image ties back to the words. A cigar-shaped craft that never appears in public feeds. A pipeline that favors shrinking. A spreadsheet that reads like a navy. The picture tried to tell the same story the cells did. This isn't a test. This is routine. The knock on the door. 3 weeks after that frozen cursor, someone knocked like they already owned the place. Early morning, gray light, the air thin in his chest. He opened the door and saw suits, badges, a look that said this wasn't a chat. They moved past him with the calm of people who've done this 100 times. Computer, one said, and everything he'd clicked in the dark suddenly felt loud. They weren't guessing. They had dates, IP traces, a list that sounded uncomfortably like his late nights lined up on a timeline. They boxed his tower. They bagged drives. Every cable felt like a confession as it came out. He asked what he was being accused of. The words hit hard. Unauthorized access, damage to critical systems, national security risk. He tried to say he'd only looked, that he hadn't destroyed anything, but the room had already decided. At the station, the questions didn't care about nuance. Why NASA? Why Department of Defense? What did you take? He kept saying he didn't copy the file. He'd taken file names, noted paths, that was it. They wrote, installed backdoors. He said he left notes on a couple machines, dumb jokes, not threats. None of it softened the script. Across the ocean, the Department of Justice had drafted a story where he was the villain, clean and simple. Then the headline started. Bumbling hacker. World's biggest military hack. 2 scripts at once. In court, the claims got bigger. Systems taken offline, costs in the tens of thousands or worse. He heard figures that didn't line up with what he knew he'd done. Browsing isn't smashing. Still, the papers painted him as a wrecking ball. And behind that, the quiet machinery of extradition began to hum. The Crown Prosecution Service got involved. The Home Office issued statements that felt cold even when they said they'd consider his health. He was diagnosed on the spectrum. He slid into depression. His mother watched reporters stake out the street like predators. That's how pressure works. It isolates you. Friends fade. Money bleeds. You start thinking more about court dates than sleep. The process becomes the punishment. His lawyers tried to cut through the fog. They argued proportionality. No data wiped. No sabotage. A non-violent offender facing a lifetime in an American prison cell? The UK courts wrestled with it. The US filings didn't blink. They wanted him on a plane. Maximum penalties hung in the air like a threat to anyone else thinking about peeking behind the curtain. Here's what stuck out. If this was nothing, a bored guy poking around, why fire up the full machine? Why frame it as a national security event with catastrophic harm? Why push so hard when the technical record looked like read-only curiosity most nights? You don't send a message that loud unless you need the echo. Meanwhile, NASA made careful statements. Concern for systems. Cooperation with law enforcement. Nothing about images, nothing about spreadsheets, nothing you could hang a question on. The silence around the specific claims was tight. Instead, everyone talked about intrusion, about deterrence, about making sure this never happens again. You could feel the center of gravity, the facts that mattered, pulled into a compartment nobody in public could see. He shuffled between hearings, thinner every time, voice smaller. Court filings stacked up like bricks. Expert affidavits argued risk. The numbers got big, the words got sharp. He'd go home and sit in a room that felt stripped bare, like his life was evidence now. He said later that the worst part wasn't the fear, it was the doubt. Was he crazy? Did he misread what he saw? Or was he being punished because he didn't? Skeptics said the case was simple. A hacker broke the law, end of story. But the human cost told a different one. This wasn't just about a keyboard. It was about making an example. The message was clear. Curiosity at this scale will ruin you. In the aftermath of every hearing, that silver, seamless shape flickered in his head. So did two ship names that didn't exist anywhere you could search. By the time the Home Secretary finally blocked extradition, the fight had already done its job. He wasn't in an American prison, but he wasn't the same person either. And notice, no public inquiry into non-terrestrial officers. No committee holding up the spreadsheet. Just silence where the hard questions should have been. If this was trivial, they could have said so with proof. They didn't. Mapping the words to a fleet. So let's treat that spreadsheet like a crime scene.